Welcome back to the Applied Faith Podcast. I'm Tyler Y'all. Thank you so much for listening. Today, we're asking a question that might feel a little bit uncomfortable for those of us inside the church. Why does it feel like Christianity is losing its influence? For the last few decades, the strategy has been relevance. We've tried to look like the culture, talk like the culture, and use the same tools as the culture to get people through the doors of the church. We've traded pews for theater seats, hymns for rock concerts, and deep theology for life hacks. Now, don't get me wrong. I enjoy worshiping to a good rock concert, and I enjoy that we can fill huge theaters, bringing people to listen to the Word of God. So don't for a second think this is an attack on Christianity that has come for different types of music, that has come to look a little bit different than what the traditional type of church that maybe our parents or grandparents have gone to. That is not what this is, but it's how we start to show up in the culture is more what this episode is about. And here's the irony to all of this. The more we try to look like the world to reach the world, the less the world seems to care about us. We're no longer different. In Matthew 5:13, Jesus says something kind of terrifying. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Think about that. Salt is only valuable because it is chemically distinct from the meat or the food it seasons. If it becomes indistinguishable from the food, it's useless. What's the point of putting it on your food if there's no taste to it? That's why you put salt on the food, because it's already tasteless. Today, we're exploring why Christianity fails when it mimics the culture, and why the world only stops to listen when Christians start acting like Christians again. Let's look at the first side of this coin. Why we fail, why we blend in. There's a temptation to adopt the operating system of the world around us. We think if we use their methods, we'll get their attention. But the Bible actually warns us against this. In our modern culture, winning is everything. We live in a world of power dynamic. Whoever has the loudest platform, the most political leverage, the most clout, wins. When the church begins to act like a political lobby or a corporate entity, we're mimicking the world. We start using coercion, outrage, and tribalism to get our way. We think if we can just control the levers of power, we can make the world Christian. Look at Mark 10:42. Jesus pulls his disciples aside because they were arguing about who was the greatest. He says, "You know that those who are regarded as the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant." When we lord over it, people using the world's tactics, we might win an argument or a news cycle, but we lose the moral authority. The world doesn't need another power-hungry group. It needs a community that serves. When we act like a special interest group, the world just treats us like one. The second way we mimic culture is through our message. Our culture is obsessed with the self. Individual happiness, personal comfort, and living your truth. Have you heard that before? These are the highest virtues that our culture is giving the people these days. Many churches have responded by turning the gospel into what sociologists call moralistic therapeutic deism. It's the idea that God is a celestial life coach who just wants you to feel good about yourself. We've turned the good news into just good advice. But let's look at Luke 9:23. Whoever wants to be a disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me, as in Jesus. That doesn't sound like what I just described above. That is the good news, that we have to do that we have the ability to follow the way that Jesus walked. and it wasn't just good advice. There's good advice in there, but that is not what the good news is. Christianity fails when it tries to compete with the self-help industry. Let me say that again. Christianity fails when it tries to compete with the self-help industry. That is not what Christianity is. If the gospel is just about reaching your potential, why would anyone come to the church? They can just get a better version of that at a TED Talk or maybe even a yoga retreat. People aren't looking for a Christian version of their current life. They're looking for a new way. They're looking for a new life. Jesus said he's the way, the truth, and the life. That is what people are looking for, not just a self-help talk. When the message is indistinguishable from the secular psychology, it loses the power to transform. We've talked about how mimicry leads to irrelevance, but what happens when we lean into our saltiness? What happens when we actually look like the strange people the Bible calls us to be? If you're old enough, you might even remember a song that's called Jesus Freak. People need to know that we are different. We need to act different. And the reason that we do this is we show the power of what Jesus brings to us. And we'll look at two powerful examples. People don't follow Christians because they're cool, right? We already know that. They follow because they see a reality in us that they can't find anywhere else. They only follow when we act like Christ. Let's go back to the 2nd century. The Roman Empire was hit by a crazy plague, or horrific pandemic maybe. History tells us that the pagans did what was culturally normal. They fled. People were dying around them. People were getting sick from the other people that were sick around them. Of course you would leave. They threw their own family members into the streets to avoid infection. And they abandoned all of the cities. But guess what? The Christians stayed. Sociologist Rodney Stark in The Rise of Christianity notes that Christians cared for the sick, even the pagans who had been persecuting them. They stayed because they weren't afraid of death. That's what makes us different. They believed in resurrection. That's what makes us different today. They believed in what Philippians 1:21 says. To live is Christ, and to die is gain. Here's the crazy part about all of this. This was factual and true, historical evidence of a different way of living. The pagans were stunned. They didn't see a relevant religion. They saw a miraculous one. This act of radical counterculture love was the single greatest driver of church growth in the early centuries of the church. People followed because the Christians acted like the world was not their home, because it's not. Let's look at a more modern example. Just 2006. This happened really close to my hometown when I was up in PA. A gunman walked into a one-room Amish schoolhouse in Nickel Mines, PA, and opened fire. It was a tragedy no one would have ever expected, especially in that community. What was the cultural response? Outrage, demand for vengeance, and there was years of litigation and bitterness. That's what you expect in our culture. But here's the difference. The Amish community did something that the world found incomprehensible. On the very day of the shooting, members of that Amish community that were still grieving went to the home of the gunman's widow. They told her they forgave her husband. They even shared the financial donations that received with her and her children. What does that mean? The world's media descended on that town, not because the Amish were in touch with the culture, but because they were so profoundly out of step with it. They were following Matthew 5:44. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That distinction, that weirdness, it forced a secular world to stop and ask, what do they have that we don't? That is when people start to follow. Not because we fit in, but because we offer a way out of the cycle of bitterness. And as we wrap up today, I want to leave you with this one thought. The Apostle Peter calls the church a peculiar people. If that isn't true, I don't know what is, right? Especially the ones that act like Christ. If you are a Christian, your goal isn't to be the most relatable person in your office or your neighborhood or your friend group. Your goal is to be a resurrection person. We want you to be the fifth apostle. They already know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and odds are they probably didn't read those. But you are the fifth one. And if you act like Christ and you pray to God that Christ will shine through you, you will be surprised what God does through you. When we act like the culture, when we're just as angry on social media, just as obsessed with money, and just as focused on our own comfort, we are trampled underfoot because we have nothing to offer. But when you forgive someone who doesn't deserve it, when you give generously until it hurts, when you serve others instead of seeking power, you become like the salt, and you become a catalyst. The world is tired of the culture. We see that now already. It's more obvious now than it's ever been. They're exhausted by the treadmill of self-interest and power. Don't give them a Christian version of that. We need to give them Christ. That's what they're asking for. That's what they're looking for. We need to be able to provide that to them. This week, look for one area where you've been blending in, where you've adopted the world's way of reacting, and replace it with the biblical way. Be kind when others are harsh. Be quiet when others are loud. Be sacrificial where others are selfish. Let's stop trying to be relevant and let's start being faithful, because that is the only way that will actually change the world. Thank you for listening today. And if this episode has challenged you, share it with a friend you know wants to be challenged. This is the Applied Faith Podcast. I'm Tyler Y'all, and I'll see you on the next one.